If it's Thursday, a slump in the polls and an eyebrow-raising fundraising ploy. It's been a month of setbacks for the former president, and Biden's White House allies craft a 2024 strategy for the current president. Plus, crypto, corruption, dark money, and the courts. How the implosion of FTX has reignited issues tied to anti-corruption, campaign finance laws, and what Congress can do to clean it up. And 21 tornadoes in 24 hours. Louisiana in a state of emergency after a deadly tornado outbreak tears through the South, leaving a trail of destruction behind. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Yamiche Alcindor in for Truck Todd. It's been exactly 1 month since former President Donald Trump announced his 2024 candidacy. And voters across the country, across America, are now sending a clear message to him and the Republican Party. They want something else. A new CNN poll shows 31% of the country now has a favorable opinion of Donald Trump. That's the lowest it's been since March of 2016. That's before he was president. New polls from both Quinnipiac and the Wall Street Journal show similar trends, with a 59% unfavorable rating. That's the worst Quinnipiac has seen since 2015, before he was the Republican nominee. Now, his support is also wavering among Republicans. 70% now view him favorably, according to Quinnipiac. Now, that number may sound high, but it's actually his lowest since March of 2016. And many fewer Republicans, just 38%, want to see him actually run, according to the CNN poll. Yes, it's still 691 days until the 2024 election, but the former president's political liability is something that every Republican in Washington is grappling with right now, after Democrats were able to capitalize on the former president's struggles, making him a pillar of the party's midterm strategy.
There's no question that the Republican Party today is dominated, driven, and intimidated by Donald Trump and the MAGA Republicans. And that is a threat to this country. This election is not a referendum. It's a choice. It's a choice between two vastly different visions for America. He has abused his power and put the loyalty to himself before loyalty to the Constitution. And he's made a big lie an article of faith in the MAGA Republican Party, the minority of that party.
That strategy worked in the midterms, and according to new reporting from NBC News, Biden's allies are now crafting a 2024 strategy that's focused on the former president, even if his name isn't on the ballot. Same goes for Democrats in the Senate, with Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer telling NBC News, quote, "The MAGA influence on the party will not go away very quickly." And today, after teasing his first major announcement since declaring his candidacy, former President Trump announced on social media that he was raising money by selling digital trading cards featuring pictures of himself. A few hours later, his campaign put out a press release on censorship in Silicon Valley. Joining me now with the latest from Trump world, NBC's Vaughn Hilliard at the White House, NBC's Mike Memoli, and for the latest from Capitol Hill, NBC's Sahil Kapoor. So, Vaughn, of course, I'm going to start with you. Trump teased a major announcement. We got a money grab and a censorship policy. What can you tell us about today in Trump world?
Right. This is the moment in time where there's only one Republican who has announced the run for the 2024 presidency, and that is Donald Trump. And so at face value, when the former president of the United States says that he's got a big announcement, I think that we justifiably pay attention. Of course, that makes the case when the big announcement that he rolls out are digital trading cards that are not even for fundraising purposes for his campaign, but for the likes of himself making money personally. It really makes it difficult. It's old, the boy that cried wolf. And so at what point is it not about us paying attention, though, but is it about Republican voters who decide to stop paying attention? Because there are other Republicans that are eager to jump into this. And you just laid out those numbers there. In first read, which I would encourage everybody to go and look at the polling tabs themselves, because when you see where Donald Trump stands in this Republican Party today, it's the most dangerous territory that he's been since first announcing his run back in 2015. At the same time, this is a proposition that Republicans are going to have to face. Is it going to be just Ron DeSantis that challenges him, or are you going to have a splintered field? Because back in 2016, right before Iowa, New Hampshire, and Nevada, it was Donald Trump who had yet to break 40% support among Republican voters. And that is exactly where you see him sitting here right now. I was talking with an individual who's familiar with Donald Trump's plans here. This is a man who has not held a campaign event since announcing his presidential run a month ago, Yamish, but I am told that at the beginning of 2023, he intends to get on the road, but hold smaller, more policy-focused events. Now, we've heard this idea of policy events in the past, and he has a history of diverting very much off of it. But the big question here is, can Donald Trump continue to hold on to this, at least a stable base here, and really make other Republicans like Ron DeSantis question whether they want to do this at all?
And Vaughn, you're talking about this idea of whether or not it'll make other Republicans question whether or not they want to jump in. Trump's announcement last month, it was supposed to, in some ways, solidify support, clear the field, but it really hasn't done that, has it?
No, it has not done that. And frankly, we should not expect anybody else to jump into the race for several months even. If you talk about Ron DeSantis and Glenn Youngkin, both of individuals around both of these individuals have suggested to me that they are looking to first get through their legislative sessions in the states, Virginia and Florida, respectively. And so those legislatures will not be meeting and convening until later on this spring. So this may be Donald Trump's terrain for himself. At the same time, look where his numbers are. I think it was the CNN poll that showed back in January, 50% of Republican voters said they wanted him to run again. That number is down to just 38% now. So that's a 12-point drop. But you could suggest, is that actually that significant of a drop for a man who is, potentially facing criminal referral from Capitol Hill or even a DOJ indictment? Somebody who openly has talked about the termination of the U.S. Constitution to reinstate him inside of the White House. I'll let others determine that. But right now, despite all of these motions that Donald Trump has taken over the course of these last month, he's still very much in this ballgame. And again, the only Republican presidential candidate in the field. For now, at least, in Vaughn. And you, of course, spent a lot of time with Trump world. What are people close to President Trump, people who maybe have been backing him for a long time, what are they saying about these polls? And do they think that the midterms possibly hurt him in a way that will hurt him possibly in the long run? They consistently tell me to look at the Republican field, that this is going to be a Republican electorate that determines who their nominee is. And when you look at some of these numbers here, there is reason to believe that Donald Trump can coalesce a great coalition of Republican support here among voters still. In that CNN poll that I referenced, 8 out of 10 Republican voters said that they are either fully supportive of Donald Trump as the nominee or could see themselves voting for him in the general election. And so, the folks that are around Donald Trump, they say, look, until folks start actually voting or these numbers start to crumble, any suggestion that he is disappearing, everybody should hold on to that. And especially when you talk about a $100 million super PAC that still has quite a cash bag that they are ready to spend that, frankly, these other candidates don't have to their name. Well, definitely something we'll keep watching. Vaughn, thank you so much for joining us. Now, Mike Memoli at the White House, you have some great new reporting about what the White House is planning to do, their strategy. So how much is the White House trying to really make Trump the focus, even if he isn't the nominee? And what will that actually look like?
Well, Yamish, if you think back to this summer when President Biden was probably at his political low point, there were a lot of questions among Democrats about whether he should or would run for president again. And you even had the likes of Gavin Newsom, J.B. Pritzker, other Democrats beginning to sort of kick the tires, think about running. What was the response that we got from President Biden, or at least what was his private conversations like with Democratic allies? It was, I am the only person who has beat Donald Trump, and I am the only person who can probably beat him again. So now you have a situation in which, well, they're envisioning a world in which, as I talk to Biden advisors, they say, I'll believe it when I see it in terms of somebody other than Trump being the Republican nominee. But they're guarding against the idea that Trump may not himself be on the ballot. So they want to make sure that Trumpism still is. So what does this look like? We saw an example of this just last week when the former president, called essentially for putting aside the Constitution. And the White House was very quick to call that out and to call on other Republicans to state unequivocally whether they agree with that proposition. And that's really what some of this strategy looks like, challenging Republicans to either stand alongside Donald Trump or to risk the opposition of his loyal base of supporters and speak out against him. I think you're also hearing not just a political strategy, but I'm told this is also reflecting a real moral conviction of President Biden. He's been talking to historians about the rise of authoritarian movements, and part of what we're seeing is his response to that advice, which is when you see this kind of radical talk, putting aside the Constitution, among other things Trump, we know, has said, you need to call it out aggressively and widely and consistently. And that's part of what that montage showed. The president was, of course, criticized during the run-up to the midterms for maybe talking too much about this idea of democracy being on the ballot. The White House feels validated by the midterm results that were better than everyone expected for his party. And so it's a strategy they intend to continue for the foreseeable future.
And Mike, you're saying that the White House is feeling validated by the midterms. I wonder also, is the White House feeling like the president, this is his only path forward, that he ran for president in 2020 to beat Trump, and now this is really his big selling point, his one selling point?
Well, a lot of the conversations that are happening in the West Wing right now, they're actually meeting with a number of groups, allies, constituency groups, partners in governing for the last year, and they're talking about how to better message the accomplishments of the administration in the future. So this isn't simply going to be, when we expect a re-election campaign to take shape, a campaign about Trump. They think they have a real strong case to tell. You've seen them tout the inflation easing. You saw a little bit of trolling, in fact, from President Biden's political account today about a quote-unquote big announcement of his own. The big developments being, bringing Brittany Griner home, seeing job announcements in Arizona. And so they think that the president's going to spend a lot of his time maybe trying to get some bipartisan work done to the extent that's possible with a Republican House, but otherwise traveling the country and doing more groundbreakings around the infrastructure law, more job announcements around the CHIPS and Science Act. And they think that really sets up a strong case for him for re-election.
Well, an interesting strategy. Thank you so much, Mike Memoli. And Sahil, you talked to Senator Chuck Schumer, and it appears he is also all in on the MAGA train ahead of the 2024 Senate races. He's told you, quote, the MAGA influence on the party will not go away very quickly. They're very strong, they're very active, they're very hard right. He said, arguing that the MAGA group, that's the way out there, that their way out there, rather, will hurt Republicans, even if Trump isn't their 2024 presidential nominee. So in some ways, echoing what the White House strategy Mike was just talking about. What did you make of what Senator Schumer told you?
It was quite an audacious prediction, Yamish, by the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. Given how difficult the 2024 map will be for Democrats, there are 3 Republican-leaning states where the Democratic incumbents are going to have to run way ahead of the Democratic presidential ticket, whoever the nominees are, in order to win re-election. And those 3 states could be ballgame, given that Democrats are looking at a 51-seat majority, and that too barely, given that Senator Kyrsten Sinema in Arizona has switched parties from Democrat to independent. But Chuck Schumer cited a couple of reasons for why he's so confident when I pressed him on that. The first is he believes that the Democratic-controlled Congress has passed a number of laws in recent years that his candidates will be able to campaign on, where benefits will start coming to fruition, including lower prescription drug costs, including more infrastructure spending, more jobs created around the country as a result of the CHIPS and Science Act. And he also did mention, as you point out, that the contrast with Republicans is something he's quite excited about. He said the so-called MAGA influence will persist in the party, that Donald Trump's influence isn't going away, even if he isn't the nominee at the top of the ticket in 2024. And that contrast will continue to alienate voters, particularly suburban voters, in his view, who have trended away from Republicans toward Democrats. He used the word realignment when talking about that segment of the electorate. And as a result of all of that, he feels very good about Democrats' chances in 2024, even though it's not just those 3 Republican-leaning states that Democrats are defending seats in. It is 5 purple states, including Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Nevada, and then that Arizona seat where Sinema has presented a bit of a predicament for the party. Do they support her in order to beat the Republicans, or do they risk a 3-way battle, an independent versus a Republican versus a Democrat, that could possibly help the Republican win?
Certainly a tough map. You were also, of course, on the Hill today, which is where you are now. What was the reaction among lawmakers after former President Trump's, quote, big announcement? What are they saying up there?
Not much. You know, it's on Capitol Hill, most Republicans, especially on the Senate side, on this side of me, don't like talking about Trump. They've been avoiding him. They dodge him. Recently, you've seen Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell open his press conferences by rebuking former President Trump and certain things that he's done, including the calls to terminate the Constitution, including that infamous white supremacist dinner that he recently had. And I asked McConnell a few days ago about the 2022 election as well, getting back to the earlier theme, how to fix that for 2024. For the first time ever, I'd heard him identify Donald Trump explicitly as part of the problem that Republicans had in 2022. One of the reasons that he says so-called candidate quality ended up being a problem, it's because of Trump's endorsement. So you add all this together, there's a rare point of agreement between Democrats and Republican leaders, at least some of them, that Trump is bad for the GOP at the top of the ticket.
Well, thank you so much, Shahil. Great interview with Senator Schumer. And coming up, more on Trump's NFTs and what the former president's slumping poll numbers mean for the Republican Party and the White House. The panel's next. Welcome back. As we said at the top of the show, polls show former President Trump's political standing is on the decline. His handpicked candidates lost in midterm battleground states. Members of the GOP are getting more comfortable speaking out against his controversial statements. And his 2024 presidential run has failed to clear the field thus far. Mr. Trump promised a major announcement today. And while he did release an online censorship platform, he also put out an infomercial-style video hawking Trump trading cards. Here's a portion of that video.
They're called Trump Digital Trading Cards. These cards feature some of the really incredible artwork pertaining to my life and my career. It's been very exciting. You can collect your Trump Digital cards just like a baseball card or other collectibles.
Quite the video. Joining me now on set is Susan Page, Washington Bureau Chief for USA Today, Faiz Shakir, Senior Advisor to Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, and former Florida Republican Congressman Carlos Curbelo. He's also an NBC News political analyst. So, Susan, former President Trump's big announcement to make money and insert himself was really, in some ways, the latest in this sort of online speech wars. Is this a serious campaign right now? We've seen him obviously say he's running, but he's not really done much other, it seems, than release digital trading cards.
Yeah, well, and of course, that's a big step. I mean, I think Washington, Jefferson, I think they all had their moment of releasing their trading cards. You know, since he announced he was running, he has not done much running. And what we found in our new poll this week is, for the first time in 6 years, significant erosion in his support among Republicans. You know, we didn't find that after Access Hollywood. We didn't find that after January 6th. But in the poll we came out with this week, we have seen Republicans lose support for him running for president, although they still want Trumpism on the ballot. They still want Trump policies. They're not so sure about Trump anymore.
If this were anyone else running, would we call him a kind of gadfly? Or what would you make if this wasn't a former president?
Well, of course, he is a former president. He
Yes.
also has, even though he only had 31% support in our poll, 31% in a great big divided field could be enough to win the nomination. But he is clearly in a weaker position than he has been since he became president in 2016.
We're used to him hawking materials. Remember the big red hat, which obviously stays with him. So we're used to seeing propaganda from him for self-profit. But what's interesting is just like he's lost his touch. I mean, he got his Twitter account back, and we haven't heard from him on Twitter. It's like he doesn't have anything to say, which is interesting for somebody who's been so vociferous and, you know, always got some kind of way to troll you. He's been very oddly quiet because I think he just doesn't have an agenda or anything to talk about.
Yeah, Yamiche, and I think people maybe are afraid or hesitant to say this or to observe this, but it really looks like this is the beginning of the end for Donald Trump. It looks like the next bankruptcy for Donald Trump is in the horizon now. And sure, we're traumatized. He has surprised us before. But this is really pathetic. This is you know, beneath so many things. And Republicans are starting to lose their fear. That, to me, is the number one indicator that this is different.
Somebody has to run against him, right?
Well, that's coming.
Right.
But all these people are smart. They don't want to get into the mud now because they know that can only help him. He is sinking on his own, and the Ron DeSantises of the world don't want to send him a lifeline.
But you still see Republicans reluctant to take him on directly. They ignore him. They decline to endorse a statement he's made. But there's still not a lot of vocal, the Republicans who are vocally criticizing Donald Trump these days in public are the Republicans who are no longer in public office.
Right. Like, you would think that DeSantis or others, Yamisha, like, that they would be loud and proud at the moment when he's engaging terrible anti-Semitism. Where are they? Like, these are moments to just say these 80% views or 90% of the American public is with us, not Donald Trump, and yet they are silent, which suggests, are they really ready to take him on? Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask you, you've run political campaigns. I mean, Bernie Sanders, I was exhausted in 2016 because he was in 18 states all the time, running so hard. Is this really going to cut it? And is there legal benefits possibly here for,
I think Trump
former President
he's
Trump?
making the calculation that he's got 30-40% of the Republican base with him, and they're going to stick with him, and no one's going to dare to take him on. And he's not going to run a real campaign until somebody wants to punch him in the nose. And I think he knows if somebody wants to get in the ring, then finally he's got a foil. Now he's got a message. Now he gets to take somebody on. And, you know, to your point, Congressman, is that I'm not sure anyone wants to. I'm not sure anyone on the Republican side is ready to get in the ring with this guy.
Well, and to me, there's no question that part of this, at least, is a legal defense strategy. Former President Trump believes that prosecutors will be more careful about going after him if he's a candidate. So that's a factor here as well.
Definitely a complication if he's running, as he is running for office, and a credible candidate, a credible nominee. That doesn't really stop prosecutors. And the other thing that could happen with all these legal actions is they could become an enormous distraction. You know, he could be involved in multiple simultaneous trials on civil and other issues during the campaign.
And Susan, explain these poll numbers for us. When I saw the USA Today poll, I said, okay, well, let's wait for other polls. And then the other polls came, and they also, in some ways, echoed in big ways, really, what you at USA Today found. So talk a little bit about these polls and what they show.
So by 2-1, Republican voters told us they wanted Trumpism, they wanted Trump policies, but they didn't want Trump as the nominee. And I tell you, they did have a name in mind, and that was Ron DeSantis. You know, he's not been a national figure for very long, and yet he was well known to the Republican electorate that we were polling. And by 23 percentage points, they preferred DeSantis over Trump as the party's presidential nominee last time. Now, we've seen people look really strong 2 years out, and then you don't remember their names by the time the convention comes around. But that is a pretty significant showing by Governor DeSantis.
The question is he more akin to Jeb Bush, right? Another former governor of Florida who obviously at one point was also leading in the polls, had a lot of establishment Republican support. He gets in the ring with Donald Trump, and Trump tears him apart. And I think the question of DeSantis is that at some point he will have to make a decision. Am I running or not? But the early moves are an unwillingness to kind of suggest any conflict with Donald Trump, which suggests that the campaign itself would be compromised.
And Congressman, what Faiz is talking about is something that I was going to ask you, which is this idea, it's hard in some ways to say, are you underestimating former President Trump? Because he has broken expectations, surpassed expectations, rather, in so many ways. But what are you hearing from Republicans, from people who might run against him about sort of where he is right now, his standing, short-term and long-term?
Republicans see and observe that he's unraveling, that he's in disarray, and no one wants to get in the way of that. And that's why, you know, the strategy is to not go at Trump, not to attack Trump, but let Trump set himself on fire, get himself out of the way, and then someone like DeSantis and others. There will be other candidates. Governor DeSantis is very strong now, as you said, Susan, very impressive numbers, but it's early, and I don't think he's going to scare too many people out of the race. This is probably going to be a big field, which is good for Donald Trump, but I think Republicans will probably learn something from Democrats in 2020, and as soon as someone starts emerging, they're going to get out of the way because none of them want to see Trump again.
And Faiz, put on your strategy hat here. I wonder when you think about sort of the reporting that our Mike Memoli has, which is that Biden and the White House are saying we're going to run against Trump even if he's not on the ballot. Is that a smart strategy? Is that possibly a winning strategy?
Yeah, for sure. For his political standing, I think Joe Biden always performs better when he's got a friction and some kind of a fight. And it's harder for him to be a sitting president of the United States trying to wrangle votes with legislators because that's messy. It's complicated. What is the friction? And you don't want to piss off people whose votes you need to pass legislation. So better for him to engage in the fight against Donald Trump, who he's beaten once before, and who animates the Democratic base, by the way, as well.
And Susan, President Biden's numbers, they aren't really great all that much either, but they're better than former President Trump's. With his sort of string of good news, you have gas prices going down, Brittany Griner's home, same-sex marriage, the bill was signed on the lawn. Could we see them go up even more? Could we see them go up sooner? Well,
in our poll, only 40% of Democrats said they wanted Biden to run for president again. And I think that's a problem. He's got a record. His approval rating's ticking up some, but there are still a feeling, I think, among a lot of Democratic voters that they're ready for a next generation of leaders to take over.
Interestingly, it seems like voters of both parties want something completely different.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder, Susan, I'll come back to you. We've heard President Biden say many times, don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. Is that where he needs to be? Is that sort of it? Just like, look at what's going on over there. Look at the Republicans. He calls them MAGA Republicans. And don't focus too much. I mean, he's selling himself as wanting to be reelected, but he's saying, look at the alternative.
And why did they succeed, the Democrats succeed beyond expectations in the midterms? It's because people looked at it as a choice election, not as a referendum on the president. So, yes, that's a smart strategy. He has some achievements in the first 2 years, some significant legislative achievements. He's likely to go into a tougher period now with Republicans controlling the House. But that is his task, to make it a choice, not a referendum.
And, Congressman, Republicans, do they want to see a President Biden back on the ballot? Do they find that to be sort of beneficial for their party? Or do they want to see someone else, young, possibly fresher, someone who we're not even talking about yet? What are you hearing?
If Trump is not the Republican nominee, then Republicans want to see Joe Biden on the ballot. If it's someone else, Republicans are confident that they can beat Biden. So, and I think Democrats, in a way, are kind of waiting to see what happens with Republicans as well, because conventional wisdom is that Biden can beat Trump. He has done it before. But if Republicans put someone else forward, Biden may not be the best candidate. Yeah,
and as you hear that among Democrats, do you hear that they are maybe looking for someone new?
Well, I mean, the last time, you remember the 2020 primary, I think Joe Biden wasn't ever considered the front runner, the one that people wanted or, even liked. Everyone went through a phase in which Buttigieg rose, Kamala rose, other people were up there, and he became the safe and comfortable choice, which I assume is still the case. Yes, Democrats might have different feelings and views, but he is still the safe and comfortable choice. Should he want to run again, and he has the stamina and desire to do so, he's got the nomination.
Well, thank you so much for this hearty and robust conversation, Susan, Faiz, and Carlos, Congressman. Thank you. Up next, how cryptocurrency could complicate the fight against political corruption. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse joins me on set next. But first, we're excited, to celebrate 75 years of Meet the Press with clips and highlights from the best archive in news. Here's a man who needs no introduction, George Clooney, of course, talking about big money's overwhelming influence in politics in 2016.
Our camera caught you having a conversation with the protesters last night. What did you say to them?
Well, that was the funniest thing. I went over to try to talk to him, and he said I was some corporate shill, which, if you know me, that's one of the funnier things you could say about me. And then he just said, you sucked as Batman, and I was like, well, you kind of got me on that one, and then I walked away, and that was basically it. But I think what's important, and what I think the Clinton campaign has not been very good at explaining is this, and this is the truth. The overwhelming amount of money that we're raising, and it is a lot, but the overwhelming amount of the money that we're raising is not going to Hillary to run for president. It's going to the down ticket. It's going to the congressmen and senators to try to take back Congress. And the reason that's important, and the reason it's important to me, is because I'm a Democrat, so if you're Republican, you're going to disagree, but we need to take the Senate back, because we need to confirm a Supreme Court justice, because that fifth vote on the Supreme Court can overturn Citizens United and get this obscene, ridiculous amount of money out, so I never have to do a fundraiser again. And that's why I'm doing it.
Welcome back. According to a filing yesterday tied to FTX's bankruptcy proceedings, former FTX executive Ryan Salame disclosed to authorities in the Bahamas, quote, possible mishandling of clients' assets by Sam Bankman-Fried. This comes as Bankman-Fried is facing charges of campaign finance violations. Prosecutors allege the FTX founder funneled tens of millions of customer assets to political campaigns in the hopes of influencing public policy revealed regarding crypto. Bankman-Fried's political contributions have since come under scrutiny. The FTX founder previously acknowledging that he has made political contributions to both Democrats and Republican candidates, though most donations to Republicans were through dark money. Joining me now is Democratic Senator from Rhode Island, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. He also has a new book out titled The Scheme: How the Right Used Dark Money to Capture the Supreme Court. So, Senator, thank you so much for being here. Given the fallout of Sam Bankman-Fried's charges, his arrest, is now the opportunity, the time to pass legislation to strengthen campaign finance laws? And really, is there any way to reverse the Citizen United's the decision here by the Supreme Court?
The tool to use to undo the Citizens United problem of unlimited dark money is the disclose bill that we voted on in the Senate a few months ago. Every single Democrat voted for it. We want to get rid of this dark money scourge. Unfortunately, every single Republican voted to protect the rights of billionaires to influence politics with dark money.
Now, both parties are becoming sort of increasingly unpopular. How much of this is due to the power of special interest groups and their ability really to influence policy here?
I think virtually all of it. I think all sorts of polls and studies show that the American people are quite fed up with Congress, and they're particularly fed up with huge dark money contributions, secret influence. And you remember wonderful Jane Mayer's report in the New Yorker where she got her hands on the transcript between the Koch brothers operatives and Mitch McConnell's operatives. And they said there was one issue that was kryptonite for them. It was terrible. They couldn't fix it. Dark money. Mm-hmm. Whether you're a Bernie bro or whether you're a Tea Partier, you hate this stuff. And we need to get out of our system. The people are right about this.
And you were just talking about sort of Jane Mayer's reporting. We've seen in some ways dark money in politics before. So why does it seem like members of Congress that they're caught off guard by Sam Bankman-Fried's attempts to sway policy, given what we know?
Should come as no surprise whatsoever. It's the way the Washington runs right now. And the main difference between the parties is that the Democrats want to stop it and move power back into the hands of voters and move information back into the hands of voters. And the Republicans are defending a system in which big dark money operations can control Congress. And they do very well with dark money. Just look at the last election.
Now, should then Republicans and Democrats, sitting elected officials, should they have been more hesitant in accepting this money, knowing that this is coming from an unregulated industry?
I think you've always got to be watchful about the sources of your funds. But usually there's a check on that, which is that the public can also see it. If I get a campaign contribution from this character, there it is in my campaign finance report. But if he writes a $10 or $15 or $20 million check to a super PAC that Mitch McConnell controls and it gets washed through donors' trust, nobody ever sees the guy's name. And that's what's unacceptable.
You're saying it's unacceptable. I should say your colleagues, Senator Warner and Senator Marshall, they introduced a bill that combats crypto money laundering in light of the FTX collapse. Is that legislation something that you would support? Are you supporting it now?
I haven't looked at the bill closely. I think that the whole question of crypto is a separate one because it's a different way of hiding your identity when you make contributions. But I do think that whether you come in through crypto or whether you come in through cash or checks or money orders, however you come in, you've got to, if you're a big donor, make sure that the American public sees that it is you playing in the political arena. There should not be masked players in America's political arena.
And in talking about the political arena, we talked about your book at the top of this. In your book, you write that the right wing is trying to, quote, capture, use the word capture, the judiciary and the Supreme Court. How worried are you that that kind of rhetoric, that it could possibly erode the public trust in the Supreme Court here?
The public trust in the Supreme Court right now is crashing. And it's crashing for a very good reason that has to do with the Supreme Court's own behavior. And I think if we're going to fix the Supreme Court and put it back on a sound footing again, the public has to understand why it got where it is. And my book shows what went wrong, and that gives you a guide print for how you fix it. I want an honest Supreme Court that behaves like a court, just like everybody else, but we got to fix the mess that they're in right now.
And as part of that sort of wanting an honest Supreme Court, you have called for a code of ethics for the Supreme Court. What other reforms do you think need to be made by the Supreme Court? Would you even possibly support expanding the court, which is something some Democrats and Democratic activists have been pushing for?
I think there are a lot of transparency reforms that are important. I think there's a code of ethics that is important. I think in addition to a code of ethics, you've got to have a way to get a decision about the code of ethics from somebody independent. You certainly ought to think about term limits for judges on the Supreme Court, justices. And I think that the question of how and when you expand the court is one that we should come to once we've explained to the American people better what the problem is. Because I think when people agree what the problem is, then the aperture for the solutions to the problem grows and becomes more appropriate. So I don't want to get ahead of our skis. I'm putting my effort into making sure that the American public knows how the Supreme Court got into the trouble that it's in, what went wrong, and who did it.
And in mentioning the American public, I want to ask you about how they're viewing the current president. We've seen President Biden have some really big wins. You have inflation slowing. You have Brittany Griner home. You have the same-sex marriage protections being codified by Congress. That being said, the polls are showing that he's not getting the sort of boost that you might expect. Why do you think that is? What do you think should be happening here?
I don't know. I'm not a polling expert and I'm not a pundit. But I do know that the president is doing a consistent, good job at delivering important things for the American people. And I have to believe that in 2024, whether we're campaigning on those things or whether they're just a part of people's lives in a way that makes them feel better, it'll make a difference and it'll be to the president's advantage.
And the Senate Democrats, of course, your party, they're facing a tough map in 2024. A lot of seats to defend. But Senator Schumer, he told our Sahil Kapoor that he seems really confident that Democrats, that they'll be able to maintain control. They'll be able to hold on to everything in 2024. What are your views on that? How do you see this?
You know, we're obviously going to do our level best to do that. I think that if you see the world the way I do, and you see the extent of the dark money influence in the Republican Party, and you see its effect on the Republican Party's ability to, for instance, treat climate change as a real problem, push back on the pharmaceutical industry, solve the injustices in the tax system for Americans, I think there's a case to be made that the system is, in fact, rigged, and we are the people who are going to unrig it. And if we can convince the American public of that, I think a very big win is possible, and I fully support Senator Schumer in taking us there.
And if you're talking about a big win in 2024, should the current President Biden, should he be running in 2024?
He is our president, and I think that he's coalesced a lot of support behind him. And I think if things continue to go the way they are, he is our strongest candidate. Again, he's got a record of really significant achievements that by 2024, when people go into the voting booth, will have started to really manifest themselves in people's lives. It's not theoretical. It will be real. The new jobs in clean energy will be real. The lower pharmaceutical costs will be real. The infrastructure bridges will be real. And I think those things will add up to a good difference.
I want to ask you also about social media and something that's really on a lot of people's minds. Yesterday, the Senate unanimously passed legislation banning TikTok on government devices. A number of Republican senators have also banned for state agencies. Would you like to see Rhode Island follow that lead? Would you like to see people who are working for the Rhode Island government have or be banned from using TikTok on their company and their phones?
I very much doubt that the Chinese government, to the extent that it has infiltrated TikTok, is going to see much gain about following Rhode Island political figures. So that is not a top-of-mind worry for me. Not with, our efforts to recover the economy, to finish off COVID, to address climate change, and to clean up government. I think we've got better things to do.
But would you like to see Rhode Island follow suit? I know it's not maybe a top concern.
That's going to be up to the governor and the General Assembly. I try not to get into their business. That's a state question, what they want to do. But we've done what we've done in the Senate, and we've made a record of it.
Well, thank you so much, Senator Whitehouse, for coming in. I appreciate it. And after the break, extreme weather coast to coast. Tornadoes ripped through the south, killing at least 3 and injuring dozens more as life-threatening blizzard conditions barrel through the northwest. We're on the ground with more next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. We're tracking multiple severe weather events in the U.S. right now. Blizzard warnings are in effect across the northern plains, where at least 18 inches of snow has already fallen over the past 2 days in some places, with about 6 more inches of snow expected in the coming hours. And Louisiana, meanwhile, is recovering from a series of tornadoes that killed at least 3 people and injured more than 24 others. The state's governor said they've been hit by 21 tornadoes within 24 hours. The tornado that tore through the New Orleans area yesterday was the second deadly twister to hit the region this year. 1 person was killed in a tornado there back in March. Here was Louisiana Governor John Bel Edwards minutes ago.
This storm system brought a lot of damage to the state of Louisiana. The National Weather Service told us this morning that they're out surveying each of the different areas where they believe a tornado existed. They think at the end of the day somewhere between 10 and 15 different tornadoes, and they'll give it a strength and rating as well.
NBC's Guad Venegas is in Kelowna, Louisiana. So, Guad, tell us, what's the status of the search and rescue operations right now?
Exactly, Yamish. As the governor said, they're still evaluating a lot of these reported tornadoes. This is one of the locations where they've confirmed that a tornado came through. One of the scenes with the most destruction that we've seen. Earlier today, we saw one of the search and rescue teams here. They told me they were on their third phase. This is the third sweep they've done. And today, they're not looking for people anymore. They were essentially evaluating these structures, trying to determine if some of these houses, like the one you can see over here, are safe for the owners to go inside and clear some of their property. For example, that structure, the smaller home, those are 2 homes, one on top of another, by the way. The one on the right-hand side, they determine is not safe for the homeowner to be in there taking his property. But as of now, we have no reports of any search and rescue efforts underway anymore. The weather has improved today, and we've seen a lot of work, as you can see, from the power companies trying to make repairs here. And of course, some of the neighbors coming to pick up whatever it is they can rescue from, as you can see, the properties that were destroyed, Yamish.
And it sounds like you're saying that there's no search and rescue operations happening right now, so there are no additional people missing. If that's the case, what are survivors telling you?
Right, so we don't have any reports of people missing at the time. I've been speaking to survivors all day. I spoke to a woman who was about to leave in her car down the street before the tornado hit yesterday. She said she walked outside, got in her car, and minutes later, as she was waiting for her sister to come out of the house with her kids, they heard a noise. They saw the clouds. Her sister yelled and told her to go inside. She told me as she ran inside, she saw how quick the tornado came in. She said it was a mix of lightning, cloud, rains, and by the time she got inside, the home was shaking. She said she took the kids inside the bathroom. They hid in the bathtub trying to find some type of protection. Their home was shaken. Fortunately, it was not destroyed like some of the homes you've seen here. There was a person that died in this neighborhood, and 7 people were injured. And that's the description we've gotten by some of the survivors here. There's another woman down the street who told us she had to crawl out of her house because the walls were destroyed, and there was a small opening left between a door and a wall, and she was able to crawl out through there. A lot of the neighbors have been here today trying to help each other get whatever items they can take from the debris, but that was the experience here at just one of the tornadoes that hit Louisiana through the storm, Yamish.
Important reporting, Guad. Thank you so much for joining us. And turning now to Peru, which is under a nationwide state of emergency after a week of violent political unrest set off by the ouster of then-President Pedro Castillo. Authorities say 6 people have died and more than 100 police officers have been injured. Today's declaration suspends civil liberties, including the right of assembly, for 30 days. Peru's new president says the national police and the military will enforce the emergency order. Castillo had tried to dissolve Congress just before an impeachment vote, the third of such votes since Castillo took office last year. Hours later, lawmakers voted overwhelmingly to remove Castillo. He was then arrested and faces charges of rebellion and conspiracy. And still to come, President Biden looks to address global food insecurity at a summit with dozens of Africa's top leaders. Details on the meeting and the administration's new commitments next. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Right now, President Biden is speaking on the issue of food insecurity during the final event of the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit here in Washington. At the top of his remarks, the president underscored how climate change, drought, and the war in Ukraine have deepened the food crisis in Africa. President Biden has vowed to renew U.S. commitments to Africa on issues like trade, stability, and health care. And earlier today, he announced plans to make his first presidential visit to sub-Saharan Africa next year. Joining me now is David Miliband, President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee. So thank you so much, David, for being here. How significant is the president's focus on food insecurity during this Africa summit? And where should this rank as a priority when you think about, of course, all of the things that the president is talking about and dealing with?
Well, hi, Yamiche. Thank you very much for giving some attention to this very important issue. I think the president has really raised the game of the administration through this summit in very substantive ways. We've released a report this week that shows that over 20 million people in East Africa alone are suffering from food insecurity. And the predictions are that 750,000 or so in Somalia, just one country, will be in famine status by next year. So this is a very timely initiative. I think a couple of things are very significant. Firstly, there's real money behind this. 80% of international aid to Somalia is now coming from the US. So there's real leadership. What we haven't yet got is followers, so other countries need to follow in this wake. Secondly, I think it's very significant that the president has recognized the link between what's happening in Ukraine, which is at the top of the geopolitical agenda at the moment, and the African situation. African countries are paying the price of the Ukraine invasion because of what's happened to food prices and energy prices around the world. So there's geopolitics involved here. Thirdly, China has been a very significant actor in Africa over the last decade, and America has too often been, and the West more generally, has too often been absent. And I think that this is a very important signal that there's a structured relationship being built here. What we would say as a humanitarian organization is that alongside the politics and the trade, it's absolutely vital that those tens of millions of Africans who are being left behind by global prosperity, or worse, are in the absolute eye of the storm when it comes to the climate crisis and the conflicts that still besmirch too much of Africa, that they're not forgotten in this discussion.
And you talked about sort of the impact that this could have. So I wonder how important it is that African leaders, you have presidents and a number of officials, that they're actually in Washington to have this conversation.
Well, it's only important if there's some plain talking. And I'm impressed that there has been some straight talking and some plain talking. Part of the story of Africa is that there's Africa rising, and it's right to emphasize that. It's a burgeoning middle class, over 400 million people, 350 million people in the middle class. But it's vital that we don't ignore the three drivers of crisis that we highlight in the IRC's report this week. One, there's a lot of conflict in Africa, in Ethiopia, in Somalia, in Mali. In countries that are represented there, conflict is a feature. Secondly, the climate crisis is here now in Africa. And thirdly, the global risks that are around, like the pandemic, as well as the economic uncertainty that's been created out of the Ukraine crisis, those mustn't be ignored, because frankly, there are still 200-300 million Africans who are, if they're pushed to the edge, they're going to fall over. And it's very, very important that they're not left behind. This is a continent that will have the largest population growth between now and 2050. It's vital for the future of the continent, but also, frankly, the wider world, that we sustain the important growth rates that have been achieved in the best performers and tackle the really significant problems in the watch list countries that we've highlighted this week.
And you talked about some of the challenges that are being faced. What is the current impact of the war in Ukraine on African food insecurity? According to the IRC, 90% of grain supply of Somalia comes from Ukraine and Russia. That grain deal is, of course, still very shaky. How does that potential for a potential famine hinge on that agreement?
Well, I think that the famine consequences are really hinging on the global response, because we know how to tackle starvation. It's a matter of resources and organization. But for the next level down, for those who are not yet at what's called level 5, but those who are at level 3 and 4, which means they don't know where their next meal is coming from, even though they're not in the starvation status, the consequences of the war in Ukraine are twofold. One is the grain deal that you very rightly highlight. 90% of Somali grain, of wheat actually, comes from Ukraine. There's obviously the fertilizer issue out of Russia. There's a false narrative being put out that there are sanctions, Western sanctions, that are somehow creating this food crisis. That's wrong. There are no sanctions on agriculture. But there's a second part of this. The Ukraine war has driven up energy prices. Energy prices drives up fuel prices. Transportation costs are an important part of the food basket. And that's part of the reason that you've seen a 40% rise in food prices in the 20 countries of the IRC watch list, double the level of food price inflation in countries like the US or Western Europe. So there's a very profound impact of the Ukraine crisis. It's not just a European problem, it's a global problem.
In 10 seconds here, do you trust Turkey to continue to broker those deals?
Yes, Turkey has a very strong interest in playing a good brokering role on this, so I'm hopeful. The problem isn't Turkey.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, David Miliband, for joining us. And, of course, thank you for being with us this hour. Chuck is back tomorrow.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.